The night the twins screamed for the third hour straight, I counted 17 people who walked out of the East Wing. I know because I was the one standing in the corridor with a mop I wasn't using, watching the doors open and close like a tide going out. Healers, nursemaids, 2 senior Omegas from the Capitol House. Even old Margaret, and Margaret had served the Blackthorn bloodline for 40 years. She walked past me without a word, her hands pressed flat over her ears, her face the color of old chalk. Nobody looked back. I pressed myself against the wall and let them pass. My name is Sira. I was 22 years old, a third-grade Omega maid assigned to the lower household staff of Asheville Palace, which is a polished way of saying I scrubbed floors, carried linens, and was not supposed to exist anywhere near the royal family's personal quarters. I had no rank worth speaking of. My designation mark was faint, almost like my biology was embarrassed about me. And 3 weeks before the night I'm telling you about, I had been rejected by my fated mate in front of 40 witnesses at a bonding ceremony in the Eastern Hall. His name doesn't matter. What matters is the way he said it, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of tired practicality that was somehow worse. She's not suitable. The bond won't serve me. Like I was a tool that had come back from the workshop slightly bent. I had stood there while people looked at their shoes. The rejection left a mark not on my skin but somewhere behind my sternum, this hollow knock every time I breathed in too deep. Other Omegas told me it would fade. Some of them looked at me with pity. Some looked relieved it wasn't them. I kept working because what else do? You keep your head down. You carry the linens. You pretend you don't feel the echo. So that's who I was, the hollow-chested mop girl, the night everything changed. The East Wing of Asheville Palace was not a place I was supposed to be. But the head housekeeper, Dorna, had been desperate. The assigned cleaning staff for that corridor had simply refused. Flat refusal, written and verbal, citing, and I'm not making this up, auditory distress and proximity to alpha-level emotional projection, which was technically a valid exemption under the Household Labor Code, but I'd never seen anyone actually use it before. Dorna had come to find me at 8:30, her keys jangling against her hip, her expression the specific shape it got when she needed something unpleasant done by someone who wouldn't complain. Sira, just my name, the way you say it when there are no good options left. The East Wing, I guessed. She nodded once. I didn't ask questions. I took the cart. I went. The crying hit me before I reached the second landing. I want to try to describe it accurately because I think people underestimate what it actually feels like, 2 infant alphas in distress in an enclosed space. It's not just loud, it's layered. There's the surface sound, the raw physical crying, and then underneath that there's something that presses against the inside of your skull like a thumb pressing on a bruise. Alpha distress pheromones don't work the same on every designation, but on Omegas they land hard. Most Omegas feel it as anxiety. Compulsion, the biological need to fix it, which then crashes against the inability to fix it, which becomes its own kind of panic. I felt all of that. But here's the strange thing, the hollow knock behind my sternum, the rejection wound I'd been carrying, it seemed to absorb it somehow. Like the distress frequencies found the empty space and filled it instead of overwhelming it. I can't explain that medically. I'm just telling you what I felt. I kept walking. The corridor was beautiful even in its current state of distress. Asheville Palace was not the largest of the royal residences, but it was the oldest, and the East Wing had this particular quality of light, all dark wood and amber wall sconces and floors that had been polished so many times they held a kind of depth, like looking down into dark water. The portraits on the walls were Blackthorn ancestors, all of them sharp-jawed and composed, staring out of their frames with expressions that suggested they had never once been inconvenienced. At the end of the corridor, the door to the royal nursery was slightly ajar. I stopped my cart outside it and just listened for a moment. 2 voices, Both of them wrecked, ragged, cycling, one slightly higher than the other, one with a hiccuping catch at the end of each breath. They'd been crying so long they developed their own rhythm, almost call-and response, each one setting off the other. And underneath it, silence, which sounds like a contradiction, but what I mean is there was no adult voice, no soothing sound, no one in there at all. I pushed the door open. I had never seen the inside of the royal nursery before. It was large, much larger than I'd expected, with two matching cribs at its center, draped in deep blue fabric, positioned so they faced each other. The walls were a soft stone gray. There were mobile sculptures above each crib, silver and amber animals suspended on thin wire, absolutely still because no one had wound them. In the cribs, the twins. I'd heard descriptions. Everyone in the palace had. The Alpha King's children, born 8 weeks ago, the first royal heirs in 2 generations, a boy and a girl, fraternal twins, both of them apparently carrying full Alpha designation even at this age, which was unusual enough that the court physicians had documented it. What I hadn't expected was how small they were. I know that's obvious. They were newborns, of course they were small. But standing in the doorway looking at them, all I could think was how impossibly small they looked in those enormous cribs, in that enormous room, in this enormous palace. 2 small faces, both of them red and furious and exhausted, eyes squeezed shut, mouths open, crying like the world had wronged them in ways they didn't yet have words for. Which, honestly, it kind of had. Their mother, the late Queen Consort Ilna, had died 12 days after their birth. Hemorrhage, quiet and sudden, in the middle of the night. The whole palace had been in a different kind of silence since, the kind that sits in rooms and doesn't leave. I thought about that as I stepped inside. I left my cart in the corridor. I didn't have a plan. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't walking in there with a strategy or a technique. I just walked in because the door was open and there was no one else. I went to the girl's crib first. I don't know why. Maybe because her cry had that hiccuping catch and it reminded me of something, of myself, actually, after the rejection, lying in my bunk at 2 in the morning trying to breathe through it. I leaned over the railing and looked at her. She was a mess. Face blotched, hands balled into fists so tight her knuckles were pale, legs kicking against nothing. She hadn't even opened her eyes. She was just crying into the inside of herself, which is the worst kind of crying, the kind where you've stopped expecting an answer. I said very quietly, "Hey." She kept crying. I reached in and put my hand flat on her stomach, just held it there. She startled. Her whole body went rigid for 1 second, shocked out of the rhythm, the way you are when something unexpected happens. Her eyes snapped open, dark gray, almost silver at the center. She stared up at me with an expression that was half outrage and half something else, something uncertain. Across the room, her brother's cry shifted. He'd heard the break in her rhythm. I started to hum. I didn't choose a song, I just hummed, something low and shapeless, more of a sound than a melody. My grandmother used to make that sound when she was doing dishes. I hadn't thought about it in years. It just came out. The girl blinked, her fists unclenched slightly. I picked her up. Looking back, I understand that what I did next was technically a violation of about 6 different household protocols. Omega-grade staff were not to handle royal heirs without explicit authorization. There was a whole framework around it, designation compatibility assessments, pheromone clearance checks, formal staff designations, none of which I had. But she was in my arms and she had stopped crying. Not immediately, there was still some residual hiccuping, some shuddering, the way crying trails off when the body is still catching up. But within maybe 90 seconds of me picking her up, holding her against my chest, humming that shapeless sound, she went quiet. The silence was so sudden it felt physical. Across the room, her brother made a short, confused sound, like he didn't know what to do without the feedback loop. I crossed to his crib, the girl against my left shoulder, and leaned over to look at him. He was staring up at me with an expression of pure suspicion. Smart even then, those silver eyes tracking me like he was doing calculations. "You too," I said. He made a sound that was not quite a cry, and not quite not a cry. I reached in with my right hand and laid it on his chest, hummed again. He grabbed my finger. The grip was startling, full and certain. He looked up at me over my finger and something in his expression shifted, the suspicion not gone but complicated by something else. Curiosity, maybe. Recognition, though that made no sense. He stopped crying. I stood there for a long time, the girl asleep on my left shoulder, the boy gripping my finger in his crib, the room finally, impossibly quiet. I didn't hear the door. I didn't hear the footsteps. The first thing I knew of him was the scent, that's the honest truth. Even before I turned, before I saw him, the air in the room changed. Alphas have a presence that's hard to describe without sounding like you're reading from a biology textbook. It's not just smell, though there is that something dark and mineral, like stone after rain. It's more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, like the room suddenly has a gravity it didn't have before. I turned. King Calder Blackthorn was standing in the doorway. I had seen him twice before at a distance, formal proceedings, the kind of event where staff lined the corridors and kept their eyes down. I had not, until that moment, seen him close. He was not what the portraits suggested. The portraits, there were 4 in the main hall, various formal compositions, made him look composed, settled, the specific blankness of power. The man in the doorway looked like he hadn't slept in 8 weeks. He was tall, dark-haired, gray-eyed like his children, dressed in what looked like clothes he'd put on 2 days ago and not taken off. There was a quality to his face that I recognized. Actually, that same hollow look I'd been carrying since the rejection. The look of someone who has sustained a wound they haven't had time to acknowledge. He was staring at me. I became very aware in that moment of approximately 5,000 things that were wrong with my presence in this room. My designation, my rank, my lack of authorization, my uniform, which had a small bleach stain on the left cuff I'd never been able to fully get out, the fact that I was holding his daughter. I should have said something. I didn't. I just stood there. He crossed the room without a word. I held very still. He stopped in front of me, close enough that the atmospheric pressure thing was nearly overwhelming, and looked down at his daughter asleep on my shoulder. His expression was something I couldn't fully read. Not anger, something more complicated and more fragile. He reached out very slowly and touched the top of her head with 2 fingers, just that, like he was confirming something. Then he looked at me. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was quieter than I'd expected, almost careful, like he was aware of the sleeping infant and didn't want to disturb her. "Sierra," I said. "3rd grade household staff, East Annex. I'm sorry, I know I'm not authorized to be." "How long have they been quiet?" I glanced at the window. The sky outside had shifted. I think, maybe 40 minutes. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Something moved across his face that he didn't let finish. "Don't move," he said. And then he went very still beside me, and we stood there in the quiet nursery while his daughter slept, and his son slowly released my finger and drifted off too. And outside the amber sconces burned low, and somewhere in the palace someone was quietly beginning to understand that something had happened that wasn't supposed to be possible. By morning, there were 7 people who wanted to speak to me. I know this because Dorna told me, her voice carrying that particular flat quality it got when she had opinions she was choosing not to voice. 7. The head physician, 2 senior court advisors, the royal household manager, a woman named Carsto who was so efficient she made efficiency look like a character flaw, and 3 others, officials of various grades whose exact titles I didn't catch because I was trying very hard to keep my face neutral and my breathing even. They were all gathered in the small administrative room off the main kitchen, which was normally used for inventory disputes. I stood at the end of the table in my regular uniform, the bleach stain very visible in the morning light, and answered questions. The head physician, a beta woman named Dr. Voss, had the careful expression of someone who had spent a night rearranging her understanding of something. You've had no formal infant care training. No. No pheromone clearance assessment with alpha-designated infants. No. No family history of it. She checked something on her ledger. Cross-designation soothing response. Not that I know of. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. The household manager, Carsto, leaned forward slightly. You're aware that 17 qualified staff were unable to manage the situation before you arrived. I heard some of them in the corridor. And you walked in anyway. There was no one else. Carsto looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't categorize. Not hostile, not warm, something more like recalculating. The court advisors wanted to know about the rejection. I hadn't expected that. I felt my spine go very slightly rigid when the elder one, gray-bearded, rings on every finger, the kind of man who wore formality the way some people wore skin, brought it out and put it on the table like evidence. 3 weeks ago, a bonding ceremony, your designated mate invoked formal refusal. Yes. Publicly. Yes. He folded his hands. And in the days following, did you notice any changes in your sensory sensitivity, your designation response? I thought about the corridor, the crying hitting me differently than it had hit everyone else, the hollow knock behind my sternum that had seemed to absorb the alpha distress instead of amplifying it. I don't know, I said honestly, maybe. The advisors exchanged a look. Later, much later, Dr. Voss would explain it to me in the kind of careful, measured way physicians use when they're telling you something they haven't fully accepted themselves. Rejection trauma in omegas doesn't always work the way common understanding suggests. The dominant model says it diminishes, suppresses designation sensitivity, leaves residual emotional scarring, fades over time. But in rare cases, something different happens. The rejection creates a kind of recalibration. The pheromone response system, destabilized by the severed bond, essentially resets, becomes more broadly receptive, less calibrated to a specific mate's signal and more attuned to rawer frequencies, distress frequencies, the kind that infants produce. She used the phrase designated resonance anomaly, and then immediately said she wasn't sure that was the right term. I said I didn't need the right term. I just needed to understand what happened. She said honestly that she wasn't fully sure anyone did. King Calder sent for me that afternoon. Not through Dorna, not through Carsto. Directly, a young male attendant came to find me in the East Annex laundry, where I'd been assigned busy work since morning, and said simply that His Majesty requested my presence in the upper study. The other maids went very quiet. I took off my apron, smoothed my hair back, and followed him. The upper study was not what I expected. I had imagined something formal, the kind of room that announces its own importance. High ceilings, probably, significant furniture, the architecture of authority. What I found was a room that looked like someone had been living in it. A large desk buried under documents, a cold cup of something on the windowsill, bookshelves that were clearly being used, volumes pulled out and not quite put back, papers marking pages. There was a chair near the window with a wool blanket over the arm, not decorative, just there, like someone had been wrapped in it recently and set it aside. The king was standing at the window with his back to me when I came in. "Close the door," he said. I did. He turned. He looked marginally less like a man who'd been awake for 2 months. Someone had evidently insisted he change clothes, but the hollow behind the eyes quality was still there. Still that look I recognized. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the chair near the window. Then, like he'd caught himself, "If you want." I sat. He didn't. He stood for a moment longer, then seemed to decide something and sat on the edge of the desk instead, which was not what I'd expected from an alpha king. The perching on desks, the if you want. "I'm told you're the maid who had the bleach incident in the East Linen store," he said. I blinked. Yes, that was me. Dorna wrote it up. It's in the household file. Something moved in his expression, not quite humor but a distant cousin of it. I read the household files when I can't sleep. There are a lot of entries. I didn't know what to say to that. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's my reading material of choice at 3 in the morning. More honest than the official reports." He looked at me. "You're the one who was rejected at the Harmon bonding ceremony." My stomach clenched. "Yes. I'm sorry about that." The directness of it surprised me so much that for a second I couldn't process it. Alpha Kings did not apologize to third-grade Omega maids for things that weren't their doing. It just wasn't. That wasn't how the architecture worked. "It wasn't your fault," I said, which was a stupid thing to say to a king, but it was what came out. "No," he agreed, "but it happened in my palace, and I've been told it may be part of why you were able to calm my children last night when no one else could, so it feels relevant to acknowledge." He had a precision to the way he talked, not cold, but deliberate, like someone who had learned to be very careful with words. He told me in that same careful way about the 8 weeks since the twins were born. I knew some of it already. Palace staff always knows more than they're supposed to. It travels through the walls somehow. But hearing it from him was different. He described it without self-pity, which almost made it worse. How neither twin had slept more than 2 hours consecutively. How every qualified caregiver in the capital had either been tried or refused. How the court physicians had cycled through theories, designation incompatibility, maternal loss trauma, alpha-specific sensory overload, without landing on anything that actually helped. How he had spent most of the past 8 weeks in that corridor I'd found myself in, listening, unable to do anything. "Alphas are not supposed to be unable to do anything," he said, not self-pitying, just stating a fact. He paused. "It is a particular kind of difficult." I understood that better than he probably thought I did. "When I came in last night," he continued, "I had been in 3 consecutive council meetings about the border situation and I hadn't eaten since morning, and I came back because—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "Because no matter how bad the council meetings are, the worst thing is walking past that door and hearing them cry and knowing I can't fix it." I thought about the 17 people who had walked out. "You didn't walk out," I said. He looked at me like that was a strange thing to say. "Last night, you came in even though you couldn't fix it. You didn't walk out." He was quiet for a moment. "No, I didn't." "Neither did I." Something shifted between us very slightly, very quietly. Not dramatic, just a small change in the atmospheric pressure. He looked at me for a long moment. "I'd like you to be reassigned," he said finally, "to the nursery, primary caregiver effective immediately with a full designation clearance review and compensation adjustment." He paused. "If you're willing." 17 people had walked out of that corridor. And sitting there in that room with the cold cup on the windowsill and the blanket over the chair arm and the king perched on the edge of his desk like someone who had forgotten, for a moment, that he was supposed to sit in the important chair, I thought, someone has to stay. "Yes," I said, "I'm willing." What nobody tells you about the impossible thing, once you've done it, is that it has to be done again tomorrow. And the day after that. And at 2 in the morning, when one of them gets a stomach cramp and the other wakes up in sympathy, because their bond is already so strong that one's discomfort is immediately the other's crisis. And you're standing there in the nursery in the 3rd hour trying to remember the shapeless thing you hum and wondering if it'll work tonight the way it worked before. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it took longer. Sometimes I sat on the floor between their cribs with my back against the wall and just let them hear me breathing, steady and slow, and waited for their rhythm to match mine. I learned their tells. The girl, Lyra, would go silent for exactly 3 seconds before escalating, which was your window to intervene. The boy, Cale, would grab your hand if he was anxious rather than cry, and if you tried to put him down before he was ready, there was a grip strength that was startling in something that small. I learned their smells, their sounds, the particular quality of silence that meant asleep versus the one that meant planning something. I learned the palace at night, the way it breathed, the sounds it made when it settled, which corridors had drafts in October, where the kitchen staff left warm broth for the night attendants because winters in Asheville came in hard and early. And I learned him. Not all at once, not in any dramatic or deliberate way. The way you learn a room you live in slowly, through repetition, noticing things. He came to the nursery at night. Not every night, the council situation, the border tensions, the thousand things that a king is required to be present for, but often enough that I stopped being surprised by it. He'd come in quietly, always careful with the door, always checking my expression first before looking at the twins, as if he needed to know whether they were calm before he let himself believe it. We talked while they slept. That's how it happened, I think. Not through any grand gesture or declared feeling. Just two people in a quiet room, both of them carrying something, talking in low voices while two small lives slept between them. He told me about Ilna. Not right away, it took weeks. But eventually, and when he did, he told me honestly. She had been his fated mate, the bond deep and true, and her death had left a kind of geography that he was still learning to navigate. He said it was different from grief he'd known before, less like a wound, and more like a room in his house that the floor had dropped out of. You had to learn where the edges were so you didn't fall. I told him about the rejection. He asked about it carefully, like someone handling something fragile, which was strange and kind, because most people either avoided the subject entirely or treated it as simple gossip. He listened the way he did everything, deliberately, without rushing toward a reaction. "Do you still feel it?" he asked once. The hollow knock I'd called it when I was trying to explain. I thought about it honestly. "Less," I said. "It's still there, but less." He nodded slowly. "I think grief does that, not disappear, just find a different shape." I looked at him across Lyra's crib. "Yes, exactly that." The court had opinions, of course. I would have been naive to think otherwise, and I was a lot of things but not naive. A third-grade Omega Maid rejected, no lineage worth speaking of, no political alliance behind her name. As the primary caregiver for the royal heirs was enough to generate commentary on its own. That she was spending evenings talking with the king while said heirs slept added a different layer entirely. Carstow came to me formally, 3 months in. She had the particular expression she wore when she was delivering information she personally found distasteful, but felt professionally obligated to share. "There is discussion," she said, "among the senior advisors." I assumed there would be. "They're concerned about," she chose her words, "designation proximity and its implications." I understand. The household manager's position is that it is not the household's business to comment on His Majesty's personal, she stopped, on personal matters. "Tell them," I said, "that my focus is the children. That's the truth. If they want to discuss it further, they're welcome to discuss it with the king." Carstow looked at me for a moment, then almost imperceptibly she nodded. "Yes, I'll convey that." She was almost to the door when she stopped and said, without turning, "For what it's worth, Sira, they are different children than they were 4 months ago. Anyone who sees them can see it. Whatever you're doing, it matters." She left before I could respond. The moment I want to tell you about happened on a Tuesday in late November, 6 months after I'd first walked into the nursery with a mop I wasn't using. It was afternoon, the light coming in low and amber the way it did in Asheville in autumn, And I was in the nursery with both twins, Lyra sitting up now, learning to hold things, and Cale, who had recently discovered that he could pull himself to standing and was deeply committed to doing it as often as possible regardless of surface suitability. The king came in earlier than usual. He looked bad, not the way he'd looked 8 months ago, that gutted, sleep-deprived crisis look, but the specific bad of a man who had been in difficult rooms all day making decisions that wore on him. There was a tension in his jaw that I'd learned to read. He came in, looked at Cale standing against the crib rail with the expression of someone who just conquered a continent, and his face did the thing it did sometimes, the crack in the composition, the almost smile that was more real than anything formal. Lyra held out her arms toward him. He crossed the room and picked her up, which was not how he'd been when I first came. He'd been careful then, uncertain, handling them like they might break or like he might break if they did. He carried her with ease now. She grabbed his collar and said something that was not a word. "I know," he said to her seriously. "It's been a long day." She said the not word again. "Entirely unreasonable," he agreed. I was watching him, and not trying to hide that I was watching him, and he looked up and caught me at it. We looked at each other. There it was. I had known it was there for a while, quietly, the way you know a season is changing, not a single moment but a gradual accumulation of small evidences. The way he checked my expression first when he came in. The way our conversations had grown longer and less careful. The 3 times he'd touched my hand reaching for something, brief and light, and the quality of the pause afterward. He was still looking at me. Lyra grabbed his collar and pulled. He didn't look away. "Zero," he said. "Your Majesty," I said, and then, because it felt wrong, called her. His name in the room, first time I'd said it out loud. He breathed out slowly. Lyra, apparently satisfied with whatever she'd been saying, put her head down on his shoulder. Cale, who had fallen down twice and gotten back up twice, fell down a 3rd time and looked at me with an expression of philosophical resignation. "I want to talk to you," the king said. Not, he shifted, not in the official way, not as king and staff, just "I'd like to talk to you." "We talk every night," I said. "I know," he paused. "I'd like it to be something more deliberate." The amber light, the quiet, both twins present and apparently willing to cooperate with the moment, which, knowing them, was not guaranteed. "Then talk," I said. He did. "I'm not going to give you a word-for-word account of what was said. Some things are yours to keep. What I'll tell you is that it was honest and a little awkward and had several long pauses and didn't follow any of the shapes you'd expect from a declaration or a speech. It was more like 2 people telling the truth out loud and discovering, as they said it, that the truth matched." He talked about what the past 6 months had been, how the palace felt different, how he'd started looking forward to the nights not despite the fact that they were just 2 people in a quiet room with 2 small children, but because of it. How there was something he'd thought he'd lost, not with Ilna's death, but further back than that, a capacity to be ordinary with someone, unhurried, unbothered by rank or presentation, and he'd found it again in the most unlikely configuration. I told him about the hollow knock, how it had faded, how I thought now that the rejection had cracked something open in me that might have stayed closed otherwise, how I didn't know if I would have walked into that nursery, past the 17 people walking out, past every protocol that said I shouldn't, if I'd still been whole in the way I used to be. How sometimes being broken open is how you find out what you're actually made of. He listened to all of it. Cale pulled himself to standing against my leg and grabbed my sleeve with his full grip, looking up at me with those silver eyes that were going to make someone's life very complicated in about 16 years. I looked down at him, then at his father. "What happens now?" I asked. He considered this carefully in the way he considered everything. "There will be conversations. The court will have reactions." "I know. It won't be simple." "I know that too." He looked at me, Are you asking me to talk you out of it? I thought about it honestly, about where I'd been 7 months ago, the bonding ceremony, the public refusal, the hollow knock and the 40 witnesses looking at their shoes, the girl who was going to keep her head down and carry the linens forever. No, I said, I'm really not. There's a moment I go back to sometimes, when I want to remember what it felt like before it became normal, before the court accepted it, before the formal announcements, before the history books got involved. It's this. Late night, deep winter, the nursery warm from the heating stones, the amber light low, the twins both finally down, properly down, the kind of sleep where you can breathe again. The palace quiet around us, just the sound of winter settling the old stone. He's in the chair near the window and I'm on the floor beside Lyra's crib, my back against the wood, and we're talking about nothing particular, something he'd read, something I'd noticed, the way Cale had looked that afternoon discovering that his own feet were interesting. He says something, and I laugh, actually laugh, the full kind, the kind that came from somewhere real, and he smiles at the sound of it, and for a second the hollow knock is just completely gone. Not filled, not replaced. Just gone. Outside, snow is starting. I can see it past the window glass, falling slow and straight in the windless dark, the way it does in Asheville when winter means it. He follows my gaze to the window. We sit in it together, the quiet, the snow, the sleeping children, the thing between us that hasn't been named yet but doesn't need to be. That's the moment. They will tell you, later, the historians, the court chronicles, the official accounts, that it was remarkable. The rejected Omega Maid who soothed the Alpha King's children when no one else could. The designation anomaly. The improbable appointment. The relationship that made the senior advisors revise 3 different official protocols. They'll make it into something clean, something with a clear arc and a legible meaning. But that's not how it felt from the inside. From the inside, it felt like a mop in a corridor, and a door left ajar, and a small girl with hiccuping breaths who hadn't been expecting anyone to answer. From the inside, it felt like the hollow knock, and learning to breathe through it, and discovering that the crack it left was exactly the right shape for light to come through. From the inside, it felt like 2 people in a quiet room, both of them broken and both of them still there, talking low while small lives slept and snow fell, and the palace breathed around them in the dark.